welcome. You've got a long history with what is a very short history for EduSpark. We're just approaching 1 year old, and we love the work and the conversations and the development we've been having with you in particular. Would you like to introduce yourself in terms of where you are in the world and just how you got to where you are and why is what you're doing so important to you?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Andrew. I'm in Switzerland. We've been in Switzerland just outside of Zurich for about 10 years now. As you can tell, I'm originally from the US, but this is our 15th location that we've lived in. Hopefully, we're getting to the stage where we don't want to move every 18 months anymore. So hopefully this will be the place to be for a while. But this journey for me has been something that started when I was quite young. I have a younger brother with quite severe ADHD. And because of that, I watched the ups and downs in my family. My parents are both music teachers, so I saw that those effects of what would happen with their teacher relationships and friendships. And then when I was in third grade, I had a teacher that didn't enjoy that I finished things quickly and would bother other students because I've always been the talker. And so she sent me, as what she thought was a punishment, to the room of kids that had multiple physical and mental disabilities, which I absolutely fell in love with. Mm-hmm. So this is since third grade. I've been trying to tamp it down because I was sure I was going to be a band director. And then I decided I didn't want to be like my parents, and I was going to be a political science major, and got my first 2 C's in university and said, oh, maybe this isn't right, and went back to the teaching. And it's where I've been ever since. So those pieces all together kind of led me to my first job in Wisconsin, in Laverne and Shirley land in Milwaukee. And I had my very first job at 22 years old. I had 12 students and 12 teaching assistants. And not a single one of those assistants had any training with the students we were working with that had very, very severe physical disabilities. We had lots of feeding tubes and diapers and wheelchairs. And I was, in essence, teaching 24 people, right? Because we were all learning at the same time. And I was 22 years old, and they were all about the age I am now. So there were quite a few situations where it was difficult to assert my authority. But it was also really difficult because I didn't have any training as a manager of others as well. I knew how to be a teacher, but I didn't know how to manage and teach adults. So on both sides of the equation, we were lacking training, and we were lacking an evaluation system to be able to give some feedback back and forth. So I found myself writing an evaluation program and training program right out of college, first year of teaching, and I was really ill-equipped for that. And I've kind of come full circle to realizing there's got to be a lot more training out there for our teaching assistants. There's got to be a lot more formalized evaluation systems so people are getting feedback in real time. And then there's got to be better onboarding and ongoing training. We focus a lot on professional development for teachers, but I think we're really missing the boat if we don't also have the same thing for teaching assistants. So that's why I've written this course on EduSpark and trying to bring it together from both sides. I like to look at things from top down and bottom up to kind of try to meet in the middle. And I feel like this is part of that really important part of the equation.
I think you call that a really important characteristic of many schools, and that's the non-educators. I've noticed it with IT staff. It happens in a range of areas, whether they're in the classroom, not the central learning leader, or they support the classroom. There's this gulf between those who get access to professional development and those who don't. And the budget provision often reflects that as well. So structurally and procedurally, we have that issue. So it's a big gap, and I really applaud that work because these are people who contribute a tremendous amount to the growth of, as you say, often students who are have big challenges in their lives for lots of reasons.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to acknowledge too that it also contributes to a lot of teacher growth because they're learning from watching. If you have an adult that's with a student with a neurodiverse student or one with a disability, they're watching the interaction between that adult and that student. And we learn from watching, right? So you're going to be showing by example to the teacher who may not have as much background from your interactions. So we're all teachers. And that's kind of how I start classroom agreements at the beginning of the school year too with other students, is that we're all teachers. We're all here to learn something from each other. And that includes these people that we continue to call assistants, right? We're learning from each other.
Yeah. That draws me to really the first sort of focus question. But just quickly before that, please throw, if you've got any questions, any points you'd like to make, please throw them in the chat. I'm going to be monitoring the chat to leave April to focus in on the question, but we will stop and broaden the discussion further. And welcome Craig, by the way. Craig's been able to join us, so that's great to have you along there as well. So this whole thing around defining the name, the title, and the way that supports some of the biases that are in play. Talk to us more about this whole sense of what the teacher assistant title does to confusion or a lack of contribution to a good working relationship in classrooms. We're jamming a little bit beforehand about this. So what do you see as a part of this?
Yeah, absolutely. That historically there's been a lot of language changes. So we have, and just for some clarification, my background is much more about learning support. So that's where my field of study is. So I will reference that a lot more than general education assistants. But we hear paraprofessional, teacher's aide, instructional assistant, paraeducator. But one of the important pieces of this equation that often gets left out is that it's a status piece that goes into these words. And we know that words are powerful. And we know in the whole education field, we've worked hard at using language that actually represents who we're talking about. And in my world, in the learning support world, we're trying to use the language that the community's asking for. And so what that means is continually to check in. This is why we're starting to use neurodivergent for an individual, and neurotypical. We're using the disabled community wants us to use that word, and we're trying to work on, again, checking in, because the language will continue to change. But what's happening with teaching assistants is we're not checking in. So we need to be able to ask the community what words feel good to you, and not creating this separation. There are many schools that have a hierarchy of assistants, and these words are supposed to show who has more education, more experience, blah, 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 blah. But what it does is it continues to marginalize that group of people. Then you take communities where you're layering on top of that social constructs, such as race, that are also getting in the way of people being respected for the knowledge that they have. It's a whole nother piece of the equation. And there are many schools that are struggling with students that are not respecting teachers or assistants because of their race or their gender. That's a much huger picture that we're not going to be able to solve in this half an hour, 30, 45 minutes. But I want to acknowledge that words are important. And there are some schools that have gone to using the words student specialist, student support specialist as their label for those individuals that are working more one-on-one with students. There's no word that's going to be the perfect word. But again, I think what we have to do is check in with the community. We have to have the conversation together. What do these words mean to you, and how are they affecting how you feel about your role within the community?
So what do you see as the best practice? You mentioned a few before as we were setting up. What are examples where you think people are starting to lead the way with this, or schools are beginning to lead the way?
I've seen schools that are putting their money where their mouth is, where they're giving professional development, continued professional development to teaching assistants. I'm really a proponent of doing it over time. A 1-hour professional development course or one-off is not going to change the world. It's going to tick a box. And that's what we're trying to get away from, is this box ticking event. And I know Jane and Valerie, who are on here too, are on the same page with me there too, right? Because they're doing a lot of work about transitions care, and understand that if we pop in and do a PD for an hour, it's just going to be a yawn fest. And that's not what we're here for. And Andrew, and that's what you and Craig are trying to do on EduSpark too, is you're talking about closing the loop in teacher learning. And we need to make sure we extend that to all of the adults in a school.
Interestingly, sorry, you go.
I was also just going to say quickly that it isn't just the people that are teaching students. It's all people that are interacting with students. We forget how many other adults are in the building that have interactions with our students. And for me as a learning support, and I worked frequently with those, what we still call intensive needs. We still need to find a better word for that. Yeah. But the janitorial staff, the catering staff, I always went to them first, because they're the ones that are going to have daily interactions with a lot of my students, and I want them to be positive. And they seek those positive interactions, and they want to know how to do it better. So make sure you're giving professional development to every single adult that's in your school.
You're speaking our language. I'm trying to frame the idea of long learning, not lifelong learning, but just long learning, as a bit of a metaphor. Consider fast food with slow food. There was a slow food movement of that sense of being immersed in the experience of eating and cooking food. And that's a bit of a metaphor, if you like. And I think fast PD is as damaging as, in some ways, as fast food. And of course, it's easier to measure, tick a box, as you suggest. But our journey started with Craig and I beginning to deliver professional learning to IT staff who are often marginalised in a very similar sort of way, and don't really understand the business of education and the purpose and the vision of education for which they're supporting through the agency of technology. So it was out of doing some of that work together that Craig asked the famous question, why don't we start our own platform? But another quick one without wanting to dominate, that's something I'm reading at the moment. Leadership is Language, and it's a very interesting book from the point of view of how important language is. And one of the interesting measures in there is the coefficient of collaboration through the degree to which one person talks more than the other. And so, you look at power hierarchical structures in small units, and you find that the teacher talks more than the teacher assistant. And that's an example then of an illustration of this power differential rather than a truly collaborative level playing field. So love to get back to when did we start to have teacher assistants? What is the history of this, and how did we get to where we are now?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, unfortunately, the best concrete and longitudinal studies about this are in the US. So that's all that we really have to go on. There aren't numbers from international schools, and this is also the case in the learning support world. There are not numbers, and I would really love to be able to change that, because you can't work on a problem if you don't know the scope. And we can take small steps and we can make changes at individual schools, but I don't think that's as helpful as being able to make overarching changes. One of those being language, right? So in 1965, there were less than 10,000 teaching assistants in the whole of the US in public education. Right. And then in 85, we're just talking 20 years later, it increased 15-fold. So now we're at 150,000. And then just 10 years later, we had 500,000 teaching assistants. So the reason this started to happen is because we had a shortage of teachers, and especially a shortage of learning support teachers. And so that, coupled with the amount of children being identified as having learning needs, it fueled this, and those holes were starting to be plugged with teaching assistants because it was quicker and easier to find people that had the feel for it than people that had the qualifications for it. But the number of students that were being identified, the percentage of that did not match the percentage of TAs that we had all of a sudden. So we had 3% of kids with additional learning needs, but 10% of the teaching staff was teaching assistants. So the numbers didn't really match the way they were supposed to. But at first, they were really used for what we think of as a traditional assistant, clerical, housekeeping, monitoring, those kinds of things. But then when we had this shortage, we're talking about English as an additional language, which is a role that needs to be highly trained. And we're talking about early childhood, same thing. And then we're talking about transition to adulthood, which is a whole new can of worms when we're talking about adults, neurodivergent adults, and those with disabilities. So this huge hire of assistants, it spilled over into our international schools. And like I said, in my very first job, I wasn't trained to manage teaching assistants. I wasn't prepared, and they weren't either. So everyone's kind of feeling it out as they go, and it's one of these taboo topics that for some reason we're just not talking about. And I think it's, again, one of those things that's happened. It's happened with mental health over COVID. We're much more comfortable talking about mental health than we have been in years. But in international schools, we've also had some topics come to the surface, bubble to the surface, that it's finally time to talk about. And I think teaching assistants is one of them. I think we need to be very careful of how we are integrating assistants, how we onboard them, how we continue to train them, and how we treat them.
I think of several experiences that I've had and continue to have. Australian International School, my school principalship, I had more, as I was saying before, more teacher aides, we call them, for neurodiverse kids than we had staff in the school. And yet my own stepson, who is very strongly neurodiverse, is completely unsupported in the current Singapore system, where I have not yet seen a visible role that's equivalent to this, again, because of the focus less on the person but more on the content, which is my direct experience with the way the system works here. So, I think the world is still grappling with that. But I asked you before, do you think the raising of awareness of diversity, equity, and inclusion as a domain of thinking and addressing problems of the world, has that given a bit of a backdrop or a frame of reference for schools to start to consider the plight's not the right word, but the situation of teacher assistants in schools? Do you see that as being one of the factors?
I've seen it go two opposite directions depending on which place we're talking about, which schools we're talking about. Some schools are still going in the direction of one teaching assistant, one learner. And the Band-Aid that they jump to immediately is put an assistant with them, put another individual with that one student. So we have a lot of one-on-ones popping up, way more than we did before. But then we have other schools that are understanding the research and the literature that says that having one-on-ones inside this classroom, you're creating a bubble within a bubble, and you're marginalizing that student even more. You're separating them even more. And then what you have happening is classroom teachers disengaging with that student. So then their primary teacher becomes an untrained teacher. And this, I think if we think about it in this way, that we have the highest students with the highest needs in the school being taught by the people with the least amount of training. And if we flip that on its head and we said we were working with our highly capable, gifted students, if they were being taught by our least trained, there would be an uproar. Yes. But this is, for some reason, has become socially acceptable. I am not advocating for getting rid of teaching assistants. Our schools would absolutely crumble if that were to happen. But one of the really important pieces is to really clearly define roles. Who is in charge of what? And you want that in any job. You want to know what the expectations for you are, so you can meet the expectations. But one of the expectations for classroom teachers is you still have to engage with all of the students in your classroom. And we also know from the literature that those students that talk the most are learning the most. And as soon as you separate a student, they're no longer talking with their peers or interacting with their peers. And if the research tells us anything, they're going to be learning less. Right. And we still unfortunately hear this, when are they going to catch up? This kind of language, right? And it's still that power differential you were talking about, it makes it even greater, because the student is less than because they haven't caught up. And so we continually to promote this, and I don't think this is going to change for a very long time, but the idea that all students in second grade are going to be within this window of ability is crazy. The only thing second graders have in common is their birth dates, right? So this is just what's happened and how we've created school systems, but we're not measuring Andrew against Andrew. So regardless of where students are in their performance, we continually measure them against this theory of where they should be that's been plucked out of thin air.
Irrelevant in terms of their individual growth and where they are now. Yeah. I just absolutely love what you said before about students who talk the most, learn the most. In fact, that's the same with professional learning.
Yes.
In the opportunity for people as participants in the learning to talk. And I wonder when sometimes even in whole school programs that lack of confidence that's exerted by the culture of the differential in power in a classroom means that teacher assistants often don't talk up or don't lean in and immerse themselves in school-wide professional learning, which further marginalises, and they sort of sit and watch. That's what I've seen a little bit of. Fortunately, the Australian school, there's a very active community of engaging TAs in both their own PD and in school-wide PD, and they were very included, but that's not always the case. So I agree 100%. You started to talk about some of the things you can, that we as a collective can be doing besides the role definition. What else would you feel is coming up?
Yeah, thank you. I think I started to talk about the defining roles, and this is one of the more important ones, I think, that just doesn't happen, and things start to bleed into who does what. And if you think about it in this way, that let's say Valerie and I are skiing, and I fall and I break my leg. She calls Rega. The helicopter comes. The EMTs are there to help me, and these beautiful men are carrying me into the helicopter, right? But what happens in the helicopter is these people are just keeping me safe until they can get me to the surgeon to work on my leg, right? There's a clear definition between what those emergency medical technicians are doing versus a surgeon. They would never in that moment perform surgery because it's not in their role. And we need to be extremely careful of what those roles are between teachers and assistants, and not because there's a power differential, but because there's an education differential. And a lot of times I hear when I'm working with TAs, we do one-on-one sessions quite often. A lot of times I hear, I'm really scared of what was just asked of me. They just asked me to talk to a parent about XYZ, and they've told me before I'm not supposed to be doing that, and that's the teacher's role to do that. And you get into a lot of issues because the roles are not clearly defined, and because of the power differential, the assistant is afraid to say, hey, hang on, that's something you're supposed to be doing as the teacher. So clearly defining those roles right away and then revisiting them. Are we keeping within this? Is everybody happy? And trying to talk about reflection in a way that's more comfortable instead of more adversarial. Which leads me to another one, which is having a very clearly and defined way of evaluating progress. Talking about using the teacher as the mentor instead of the boss. We learn from watching, like I said before, and using that relationship as a mentorship. The other thing I like to help schools do is look at their assistants in terms of their lens of strength. What are their strengths, and not just saying this is the role we have available and we have to put one person into it, but who are the people we have available right now and what are their strengths and weaknesses? I had a friend who was studying in the UK for her PhD to be an educational psychologist. And at the time, she was working 2 side jobs to pay for that. She was a piano teacher, she was a concert pianist, and she was working as a teacher assistant because there were a lot of the things that she was doing in her schooling that needed to be documented and done in real time. So over lunch, she would take her sandwich and she would go into the practice room and play on the piano just to release some stress. And she was in a 4th grade classroom. Teacher walks in and said, "I didn't know you played the piano." And very soon after that, they started using her and her strengths to go into the music room and teach some of the piano courses that were going on. But you have to be open to people's strengths and utilizing those in the best way possible. And we do this with students. We're talking about strengths-based learning in terms of our students, but why aren't we doing that for adults? Right? One of the big things is that we need to teach our assistants how to provide seamless and silent supports. And that means we're not just throwing in a warm body. We're not just putting someone in and making it all better. I had a 5th grade student that was going into a new school, very mild ADHD. School was scared to death to have this boy join the school for some reason, and said the parents had to pay for 4 hours of a teaching assistant a day. And I said, "Do you know how many other students in your classroom have undiagnosed ADHD that are sitting with that you don't provide a one-on-one assistant with?" And one of the things that happens with ADHD is executive functioning skills tend to lack, right? And so having a one-on-one assistant meant this boy's executive functioning skills became worse because now he was relying on an adult who felt that she needed to do something to support him. So we have to be really careful that we're not just putting an adult there to be a warm body, and it actually makes things more difficult. So another one would be, we don't want to make students reliant on one individual. I had a student of mine in that job where I had 12 assistants, and I was the only one that could coax him out from under the table. And at the time I thought, oh, this feels great. He really needs me. But then if I'm out sick or I have a meeting or something, he stays under the table the whole day.
Dependent.
Right? So we need to be really careful that we continue to treat all students in the same way. We would never make one student rely on one adult in the general education classroom. So we shouldn't be doing that also with one-on-ones. We want, the research says about these one-on-ones that when you start to pull back on one-on-ones, you increase teacher engagement, those conversations of the classroom teacher. You are starting to listen to the student that's neurodivergent or has a disability. They should be as much a part of their education as any other student, and listening to what their desires are and their hopes and dreams are really important. So this is something that schools need to start grappling with, is the social validity of the supports they're giving. So I just want to encourage that we look at this as not as the very first thing that we do to solve problems, but as the last resort. Adding another adult should be a last resort option. What are all the other pieces leading up to that? And that means there has to be so many other pieces to the puzzle that schools are dealing with. and talking about co-teaching as options at school, training the whole staff on neurodiversities and disabilities, and not just having, the learning support teachers being the gurus. This is knowledge everybody deserves to have. And then finally, the biggest one is this systematic training of teaching assistants. What is your school's plan for training teacher assistants over time?
I think that systematic approach is really important for some of the other problems you mentioned. When there's a backdrop of a school culture and a school vision that defines those roles and says to all of its faculty, don't hand off the responsibility of parent contact. When there's that culture of the norm of the way that we work together, and that defines the way we work with this role in the classroom, then it provides a baseline support for the faculty of teacher assistants, for want of a better word, to give them the confidence to know where they're going to deliver their best value towards the help of a range of students. So I think that's again why this sort of whole school approach, and I know you do work with a number of whole schools, but I see this as leadership being aware of the broad issues, practitioners themselves, the people who have teacher assistants in their classrooms, parents as a key, and even students, and being open and clear in classrooms about diversity in a range of ways, but particularly neurodiversity in classrooms, and giving that as a sense of this is the way life is. And we've got people with a whole range of different attributes and dispositions and approaches to life. And so that's why it has to be this sort of global approach. Do you see that systematic approach growing in schools, or is there still a need to educate schools for the need for this sort of approach?
There's always room to grow. This is like talking about curriculum. You're never done. Yeah. This is always a way to grow. And because it's a field that has so much research going on in the background, we're learning all the time. And it's not one of these fields that you can just sit back and say, okay, I know it all. I'm ready to go. I can teach it. So we have to be willing to acknowledge that maybe some of the practices that we've been doing at the moment aren't best practices. But now that we've learned and we know better, now we can do better. And there's no judgment at this point. We're all doing our very best to get better. So I think there's a lot of concern on a completely different note about elitism. And Conrad Hughes just had a great article about this elitism in international schools and the fact that we need to start moving away from this. And the only way to do it is to acknowledge our past wrongs and say, you know what, we know better now, and we're going to start to move in this direction. It's not going to happen like that. And it shouldn't happen like that. That's when bad things happen, is when we make changes too quickly, people aren't on board, and we don't have the training and the background knowledge. But in DEIJ, there's a whole range of things that need to be done. Of course, my focus is disability inclusion, but I think schools need to realize that their test scores are not the best and most important thing to be able to put out there to the world to get more money from parents coming to their schools. I think the demand from parents is starting to change a bit too. We talk about developing global citizens in our international schools, but you don't develop global citizens when all the kids learn and produce in the same way. You can't say that international students all look the same. They all come from different places, but we're talking about very similar socioeconomic status of all of the students. And we're talking about kids that learn in this box and can achieve at that level. So if parents start to demand schools that have a range of students and learners that reflect the actual world, that's what creating a global citizen looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a bit of that entitlement attitude that comes
100%.
that we see. Just before we go, because I'd really love to know what is it that you think we need to be training teacher assistants on in many ways. But just a chance to throw back to the group, to Jane, to Valerie, to Craig, to others that are here. Are there any questions or comments? Feel free to come off mute, jump in, or type something. We haven't really had a chance for input so far. It's been such a fascinating story. Any thoughts, questions, blocks or challenges? I love Connect, Extend, Challenge. What are you connecting with? What's stretching you? Valerie, what are you coming up with?
Hi, Andrew. Thank you, April. That was great. I just had to think about, and I'm wondering if you, because I've been out of actually teaching in international schools for 3 years now, but I recognize a lot of what you said. And one of the frustrations of the teaching assistant that I was working with in my year 4 class was whenever there was a PD day, there were lots of options for the teachers, but there was nothing organized for the assistants. And they would literally come in and she'd be like, I'll just clean up the classroom, which was such incredible waste of time and on so many fronts. And I'm just wondering, in other schools that you've seen and visited, how do they cater to the teaching assistants during professional development days?
Yeah, I've seen the same thing, Valerie. So thank you for validating that. I think it's really important to create a community of the teaching assistants because there is a lot of this hierarchy within that group of teaching assistants. I'm a huge fan of professional development in general, where we as teachers share our knowledge with each other and make each other the experts, because we all are, like I said, all have something to share and teach each other. So I tried to advocate for schools in general to stop bringing professionals in for that drop-in, but use it over the whole school year or even a 3-year period of time. And then within that, when the professional's not there, have people in your teaching group or your assistant group start to say, hey, actually, I would like to talk about this because this is something I've done a deep dive on. Or get away from people, this banking of information where I'm going to bank and deposit information into your brain. But we start the PD with a question or a problem, right? Like, I've had this going on with one of my students for a while now, and I've really tried hard to try a few different solutions. Can we just brainstorm about this? And so it flips it on its head. And instead of, let's talk about the theory of blah, 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 we're talking about something that's, you can change. You're having your PD on Monday, and on Tuesday, you can make a change in what you're trying. And then you come back and report on how that went. So you're closing that loop again. You're right. We're not just talking about it. We're going to say, okay, we're going to go and we're going to take notes every Friday on what we noticed has happened for the week. And then our next PD, we're going to bring that together and talk about it. That, I think, is the stuff that's really going to make a difference long term.
Yeah, I can't support that enough, that there's that sense of inclusiveness, vulnerability of saying, I'm not sure about this situation, using peer-to-peer relationships as much as the expert. We see a couple of different styles of content design in our platform, and the common one in the whole world is, I'm the expert, you follow my bouncing ball, you'll learn what I know, which is that sort of, I think that's where we are starting from. A lot of people think that's where we should end. I've seen some other community of practice type models where people are framing the broad domain of work to be covered and saying, what questions do you as the learner group need to solve, and how can I help you most? In other words, how can we in fact be self-sufficient in helping some of those learning needs within ourselves as much as anything? And that's certainly the change, that one of the changes that we're trying to facilitate.
Yeah. One of the least favorite questions I get from schools are, what are the PDs that you can provide? That's not helpful. I don't know if I'm going to be actually addressed, because we've been those teachers sitting in those PD days going, and especially learning support, we often are it's not as applicable to us. So I would prefer that schools are saying, hey, these are the 4 issues we're dealing with. This is these are our goals for the next year that we're looking at. How can you support? right? And like, so what you were saying, Andrew, we're going at it from a completely different angle. And then I think what you're doing is you're working with individuals that are problem solvers. And I think that's way more valuable than knowledge givers.
It's sort of leading into that question I framed before, which is one of the last questions we've got to cover. But one of my big soapboxes is that for people to feel empathy, to feel respected, the key action to take to help someone get to that point of feeling in that way is simply to know them, and so that they know that they're known. Know my role, know me as an individual, know what my strengths are. And when you're known in any relationship, in fact, when you feel like you're not known in any relationship, the relationship suffers. And so I think a lot of that inclusiveness just starts with, let's get to know you, as you were saying before with the piano teacher. So,
yeah, and being vulnerable, right? That's the other piece of the puzzle that I think schools leave out of the equation, because teachers are fearful of this, but it's a culture change that needs to happen. Is we need to have teachers say, we're doing a problem solving, we're assistants do it, we're doing a problem solving. And then you set up times where you go and observe. You watch each other and you say, hey, you know what? I'm really struggling with this classroom management piece during, when the students are working in small groups. I know you're pretty good at this. Would you come and, Andrew, would you mind watching me on Thursday at 2:00? Having that kind of culture in a school completely changes the shift in where you're going. And if we can make that change, it's only going to be for the betterment of all the teachers. But it's going to be a hard one, because we have a lot of teachers that want to lock their classroom door and not let anybody in. And as a learning support teacher that often went into other people's classrooms, I would have to very carefully say to the teacher, I'm not observing you. How can I not observe you? Come on, I'm in your classroom.
yes,
I'm an observant person. This is what I'm supposed to be doing, right? So I can't turn that off. But it was a real worry and a stress for a lot of teachers. But I had one teacher who asked, can you give me some feedback? And it flipped the relationship on its head. And so that was in my second year of teaching. It was an incredible learning experience for me right out of the gate. And I learned to start asking for that feedback really early on. It's not always comfortable.
But that's the thing. You think about the start of your career, not comfortable. When you're not comfortable, you are learning the most. Now, there's a sweet spot. If you're way uncomfortable,
That's
it's
right.
too far. But we've got to get away from trying to feel comfortable all the time, because that's when we're not learning. So
That's right. It's that zone of proximal development, right? If we're not in there, I mean, I was way at the top end my first year. I think my husband was comforting me while I'm crying way too much. That was way too much of a learning experience, right? But and it left me wanting to not teach anymore, because I thought that's what it was going to be like my whole teaching career. And the numbers out of the US right now say that the average teacher is in their career for 3.5 years, which is appalling.
huge loss.
But it's a huge loss, right? And we're setting people up for failure. And a lot of that is not having a proper mentorship and this openness to asking for help and acknowledging that you don't know everything and you need help.
Yeah. At risk of sounding a bit like what's your menu of offering, like you mentioned before the school, what do you see as the hot topics that are gaining traction as areas of, some of them might be entry points into the broader discussion of supporting TAs with good professional learning. Some of them might be later stages, but what are the things that you see are having traction as having impact, topic areas of professional learning with TAs?
With TAs, well, to back up, I think I want to make sure that we acknowledge that there is research that tells us that when TAs are trained well, they feel like they know their jobs better. It improves their morale. They feel like they're valued in the school all of a sudden, and it makes them want to stay in the job. And that's one of the biggest issues with assistants is there's a huge turnover. And the more turnover we have, the more difficulty we have creating this environment that we're trying to have where teachers and assistants know their students. It's simply not possible when there's huge turnover, right? So the more that we provide this training, the better. But I see teachers, teaching assistants, especially in learning support, needing the background knowledge. They're afraid to say, you know what? People keep talking about this executive functioning thing, but I don't know what that is. And it's not just assistants, there's teachers that don't understand that either, because it's huge. It's a really, we should be talking about metacognition. It's nearly the same piece, right? But again, it's that culture change that needs to happen. So I see where we're talking a lot about actual strategies in the classroom. When this happens, what do we do next? I'm working with a school right now, and we have 6 deep dives over the course of 1 full year of school. And the last one, the teacher's assistants just asked, can we just come with problems we're having and pick your brain?
Beautiful.
Because when you're at school, it's go, 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 go. You don't have that time. So one of the other big pieces that I'm working with schools holistically to look at is finding time to sit with the mentor teacher, which is the language I would like them to start using, and the teaching assistants, and just say, this is one of our big problems. How can we brainstorm this and get better at it? So strategies in the classroom are a big one. Background knowledge on the learning support field. What are the common disabilities that are diagnosed out there? What does it mean when a student has ADHD, but they say it's inattentive versus hyperactive, right? This kind of background information is important, that we are sure that we're bringing everybody up on the same playing field. Because then if we don't do that, we're continuing to purport and push this power differential, right? And so anyway, I don't want to get on the horse too quickly, but I think it's important to have those conversations. And so through EduSpark, I have a few different modules for assistants to be able to go through. I think it's important to, it's great to watch a video and do a little bit of homework and come back and talk about it, but to make it more formalized and make sure that the assistants feel that they're being supported as a whole person. I think it's going to make a big difference for schools.
As I mentioned before, I'm super interested in the development of almost a meta community, if you like, globally of teacher assistants, because there are some international schools, tier 2 and 3 sort of schools, that have much lower available budgets for development and sometimes much lower numbers, and people tend to feel much more isolated in some of these specialist roles. And so then to provide access to peers, and indeed to set up the possibility of mentor relationships within a community like that might support people in situations and in countries and cultures where that's lacking to a degree. So one of the things we might talk about is how to leverage some of your beautiful expertise in setting up this place where people can just hang out and ask questions like and ask the community and have community support itself as well. Your number one thing that you think any school leader or someone of influence in terms of leading the culture of an organisation, what one thing do you think they could start with by taking a first step journey into really addressing the needs of this really critical group in schools? What would you say if I was a principal having a drink at a conference? Where should I start, April? What would you say?
I would say go and ask them what they need.
Yeah, such a beautiful response.
Mostly because it's going to be different in every single school. And it's very naive to say, this is the one issue that's going to, this is the silver bullet that's going to fix it all. But I would say go and talk to the group of teaching assistants that probably haven't been listened to or asked that question. And you may have to start the conversation with, I really want to hear your opinions. Because of the power spread You may have to provide different ways of communicating their opinions. So it may need to be on an anonymous format, but you need to ask the community what they need to feel better, to feel welcome, to feel respected, and to feel that they have a depth of knowledge in their field.
And are included. I love that from several points of view. One of the thoughts that came up during our conversation as a sort of a final question from me to throw at you is that here in Asia, quite often the teacher assistant, the school non-education, the sort of operations side of things often include people who are not strong in English. And one of the often not spoken about barriers that contributes to not being included is in fact access through language. We're interested in exploring that, but in your experience with where you are situated, or in your experience in terms of what you're dealing with in schools across, say, Asia, for example, how do schools get through and past this issue of making sure that learning can be accessed, professional learning can be accessed, maybe in the best language for the learner, for the teacher assistant as a learner, that is?
Yeah, it's a really difficult one. One of the things that we're doing in the group I'm working with right now is we don't have feedback, just be verbal feedback, that so the assistants have a Google form, and they asked for this, right? So it was me saying, how can we do this better? And they said, can we have a Google form to be able to respond to the work that we've done before we get together, so everybody has a chance to respond. So number one, it's helping with language issues. Number two, it's helping with those people that dominate the conversation. So everybody gets a voice. Everybody gets to have their voice heard by me before we go into the meeting. So they're watching the EduSpark videos, and then we meet as a team in person on the platform, right? And it's consistent who talks and who doesn't. And that can be for multiple reasons. It could be language. It could be, the person. Well, yeah. And we talk about its personality, but some of the things I've been reading recently is that it's status that causes some people to talk more than others, more than personality. So I have to be very conscious of the fact that I've asked them to send me a private chat when they have a question, because it's also cultural. I have to look for the people that are looking really hard at me to know if they want to be able to answer a question, which is so hard to do when you're virtual. So send me a private chat if you have something to add to the conversation, and then I'll call you out specifically.
I love everything you've had to say, and just want to finally throw back to the group that's with us if there are any other final quick questions or comments or observations you have for April. Feel free to come off mute and jump in and say something, or type something into the chat. I'll just give you a chance. If you want to, you can throw your hand up and raise your hand, sort of thing. But just love all of the aspects. You describe so much of what makes a good school culture. These are often universal approaches that we just have forgotten or ignored this hugely valuable group of people within schools. So anyone else like to make a comment before we wrap up and let April move into her morning as it is up there? By the way, hopefully it's not too hot. It seems to be getting hot again in your part of the world.
We got some rain last night, so I don't know if, Valerie, you got rain on the French side, but yes, you did too, yeah. So it cooled off a little bit last night. I don't know if it'll stay cool today, though.
Yeah, poor old Spain's getting it again. So any other final comments from the group? Feel free to throw something in. Thanks, Valerie, there. Jane, jump in.
Yeah, I was just going to say thank you so much, April, for sharing your expertise and your experience with us. It's just been very affirming and also enlightening. So thank you. Really appreciate your time and expertise.
Thanks for being here, Jane.
So again, a formal thanks for us. This will be in two places. It'll be in the Summer Series channel, April, if you'd like it somewhere in any of your discussion areas, feel free, and we'll drop the recording into whatever you'd like to use this for. And we'll also put it in the YouTube channel. And I think that we've got to do some serious work, certainly for us at EduSpark. We've got to do a lot more for our teacher assistant group. And in fact, some of the other groups within schools that don't normally get that access that we expect to get as teaching professionals. So thank you so much again. I always enjoy every conversation we have, whether it's just talking about and planning courses with you or in a more sort of formal delivery setting like this. I just really admire your approach and your disposition to this, and the way that this is a group that needs some decent attention and respect. So thank you again, April. Stay well, stay happy, and look forward to our next conversation. And thank you, everyone else. We'll see you soon.
Thanks, April. Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Craig. Thanks, guys.
Bye-bye.
Take
Thanks,
care.
Craig.
See you.